For the last part of this module and the last part of the information that is going to be on exam number 1, we are going to briefly talk about the autonomic nervous system. So in the chapter, there's tons of information that we're not going to go over. We just want to basically know the functions of the autonomic nervous system. So this first part of the lecture is just an introduction to the autonomic nervous system, and then we will talk specifically about the functions of the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system and compare their functions. And that is the main part of what I want you to know for the exam. So the 3 learning objectives are to list the primary functions of the sympathetic nervous system, list the primary functions of the parasympathetic nervous system, and to be able to state the effects of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system of the various organs and systems in the body. On the various organs and systems in the body. So we'll talk about those. So in this first introductory lecture, we're just going to talk about it, and then in the second part, we will address these 3 things specifically. So the autonomic nervous system regulates homeostasis and reproduction by regulating the viscera, the vasculature, and the glands. So you can think of the peripheral nervous system as consisting of the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system is divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic, and the somatic nervous system is divided into sensory and motor. So those are really the vertical systems that we're going to talk about in the vertical systems section of the textbook. So we're just briefly going to go over, so really I kind of just want you to know the effects of the autonomic nervous system on the body. This is a graphic from the book, of course, that talks about all the different pathways that are going into the autonomic nervous system. So let's just look at this big picture and say it's complicated. But you can think of the autonomic nervous system as the somatic nervous system controls the muscles and the skin and the sensory information, and the autonomic nervous system controls everything else, viscera, vasculature, and glands. So we have receptors in the autonomic nervous system that are similar to receptors in the somatosensory system, which we'll talk about next, and they tell us what's going on in the body, and so then the nervous system can control it. So that's really the idea, is the autonomic nervous system has to keep control of homeostasis, keep us in line. Mechanoreceptors in the autonomic nervous system respond to pressure in the aorta and the carotid sinuses in the lungs, and to stretch in the veins, intestines, and bladder. So if the pressure in the aorta is high, it's going to send messages to the brain to adjust the heart rate and the respiration rate and different other things. So chemoreceptors are sensitive to chemical concentrations in the blood throughout the viscera and brainstem. So that's how we know how to breathe. It's sensitive to oxygen and carbon dioxide levels in the blood. So we know, and insulin levels in the blood. So we know when to, or blood sugar levels, so we know when to release insulin. And so all of this is going on in the background. We don't think like, oh gosh, I have to release some insulin. It all happens in the background, and the autonomic nervous system does it for us. Nociceptors respond to stretch and ischemia throughout the viscera. So a lot of times things that happen in the veins and the bladder and things like that, we don't consciously think about them, but those nociceptors are making us aware something's going on, something's got to change, we got to deal with this somehow. Thermoreceptors respond to very small changes in the temperature of circulating blood, and a lot of these thermoreceptors are in the hypothalamus, and they also respond to external temperature changes in the cutaneous or skin system. So the way the autonomic nervous system responds to changes is it increases your metabolism to create more heat. It makes you shiver to create more heat. So it's all about maintaining homeostasis. So these are our sensors with which we tell whether we're out of homeostasis. And then we can make those little corrections to fix it. All in the background. Autonomic regulation is often achieved by integrating information from peripheral afferents with information from receptors within the central nervous system. So a lot of the regulation goes on in the central nervous system, so it takes that peripheral information, it processes it, and decides what changes need to be made. And often changes in the autonomic nervous system are affected through hormones or glands. So autonomic efferent neurons are classified as sympathetic and parasympathetic. These are our two different halves of the autonomic nervous system, if you want to think of it that way. Connections from the central nervous system to autonomic effectors, in other words, the glands and organs that are going to then make the changes that we need to stay in homeostasis, use a two-neuron pathway, with the two neurons synapsing in a peripheral ganglion. A ganglion is a group of nerve bodies. So the preganglionic neuron extends from the central nervous system to the ganglion. The postganglionic neuron connects the ganglion with the effector organ. So we'll talk about, when we talk specifically about sympathetic and parasympathetic, we'll talk about in general what the effector organs might be. So it might be your sweat glands that cause you to sweat, or your pupillary reflexes that cause your pupils to dilate, or your adrenal medulla that releases norepinephrine to get you ready for fight or flight. So that's our effector organ. There are three major differences between the somatic motor system and the autonomic efferent system. So when we looked initially last week or a couple weeks ago of where we're headed in the cerebral cortex, we have our sensory system, our processing system in the cerebral cortex pretty much, and then our motor system. The somatic motor system are the effectors, the efferent pathways, and the autonomic efferent system is an effector. So the somatic motor system results in muscle movements. The autonomic efferent system often results in glandular response. So unlike the somatic nervous system, the regulation of autonomic functions is non-conscious. We're not thinking about it. We're not saying, oh, I have to release some insulin. I've got a lot of blood sugar. It goes on in the background, and it can be often exerted by hormones. Unlike skeletal muscles, many internal organs can function independently of central nervous system input. So our heart is just going right along with its sinoatrial node, and it's beating. The central nervous system can give it input to beat harder, but it can function independently without that. That's why heart transplants are possible. In somatic efferent pathways, they use one neuron. Autonomic efferent pathways usually use two neurons with a synapse outside the central nervous system. So both of those are our effector systems. It affects motor control and it affects autonomic control, but there are differences between the two. All central nervous system output is delivered by somatic or autonomic efferent neurons. Somatic efferent neurons innervate only skeletal muscle, and activation is frequently voluntary. Autonomic efferents supply all other parts of the body besides skeletal muscle, and it's usually non-voluntary. It's non-conscious in the background. So autonomic neurons secrete three different neurotransmitters: acetylcholine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. So those are our main guys in the autonomic nervous system. As you might remember from chapter 6, acetylcholine is also the neurotransmitter that's used at the neuromuscular junction, where the motor efferents affect the skeletal muscles. So acetylcholine, pretty important in the whole nervous system and how the central nervous system affects the rest of our body. So autonomic neurons that secrete acetylcholine include all preganglionic neurons in the autonomic nervous system. So all of the neurons that are going from the central nervous system to the periphery secrete acetylcholine. Postganglionic neurons in the parasympathetic system also secrete acetylcholine, but postganglionic neurons in the sympathetic system use norepinephrine and epinephrine. But, of course, we know the effect of a neurotransmitter depends on the type of receptors activated by the transmitter. That goes for the autonomic system and the motor and sensory systems as well. So norepinephrine and epinephrine. Norepinephrine is the transmitter that's released by most sympathetic postganglionic neurons. The adrenal medulla is specialized to release epinephrine and norepinephrine directly into the blood. So even though they're neurotransmitters, they function a lot of times as neuromodulators because they're not just in the synapse, they're every place else, and they affect more than one neuron. Receptors that bind norepinephrine or epinephrine are called androgenic receptors. You don't really need to know that, but there you go. So sympathetic neurons tend to react all together. When the sympathetic system is activated, boom, they all get activated. And it makes sense. We have those neuromodulators secreted into the blood, everything's affected.